I'll open up the lobby and we'll start the session. And more people will join, I have no doubt. So, right, here we go. Morning, Adrian. Morning, Brian. Morning, Peter. Morning, David. Morning, Derek. Morning, Neil. Morning, Podrick. Morning, Paul. Morning, Shay. Morning, Trish. Good to see you. Apologies for the background noise. It's temporary.
Yeah, probably the best for me to do the introduction, Steve, as you're very chaotic in the RSA.
Is it very noisy? It's very noisy, isn't it? Okay, so if you've just joined, if you could go on mute, please, that'd be great. And we are recording, so thumbs up from anybody. Barry, thumbs up. Neil, brilliant. Okay, I'll go on mute because it's very, very noisy. So, Henry, I'll pass over to you, and I'll monitor the lobby. So.
Okay. Well, I've described Paul as many things: irascible, diaphanous, well, not diaphanous, but certainly straight-talking, and somebody who I've very much enjoyed conversing with over the last couple of months. And I'm delighted he's be able to join us for this meeting to talk about a topic which couldn't be more topical in the light of what's happened over the past few days: the pensions review, pensions schemes bill, all of which points towards a government that would rather pensions, paid pensions, and ran on rather than just capitulated to the lockdown mentality of annuity and bulk annuity purchase. So without more ado, I will hand over to Paul, who will be talking us through a few ideas. And in the usual way, put your hand up if you want to ask a question using the electronic means. And over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Henry and Steve. Morning, everybody. I suppose what I thought was best for this conversation, and really must be a conversation because there is so many facets to go after, you can almost guarantee that whichever one I start on will be of no interest to 90% of the population. So best thing is to do is to sort of put a few ideas up in the air. And so I wrote just some, a couple of points down here, which, okay, so let's start by saying there is no fundamental difference between a DB scheme and a life insurer. We're both faced with the same ALM challenge. Let's also agree that a life insurer can be thought of as a heavily regulated CDO, a sealed system, and one that incentivizes equity holders to invest in as high yielding assets as possible. And when you look at a life co, all the executive skills, disciplines, and systems are what is required to run an ALM book of that complexity. And the regulator is there to keep the insurer compliant with the rule book. And most of all, let's also agree that an insurer puts virtually no capital in when doing a risk transfer, called a buy-in, buyout, whatever. And this can be corroborated by numerous consultants and sources at the moment. And on the same day of the buy-in, the insurer's capital, also known as retained earnings, and or future shareholder profits, increases by 15% of the notional value of the trade, even though it didn't put any capital in. So capital is magicked up. So what are the takeaways from those sort of 4 points? If it is good for an insurer to do, and insurers are, of course, the aforementioned gold standard, then it should follow that a DB scheme should be positively disposed to the same action. There is clearly a risk, a conflict between the insurer's shareholders and policyholders, pensioners. This conflict does not really arise in a DB scheme, but it is manifest, particularly if you substitute the word shareholder for sponsor, albeit one step removed. But the conflict is non-trivial, not as explicit as in an insurer, and needs to be managed. The insurer seems stacked in terms of professional skills inside the machine, not insurance executives being advised. people have noted to me quite often there are no lay directors at Rossett. It is set up and regulated as a hyper complex asset management business. And so what are the takeaways for how we run a DB scheme? If insurers are the gold standard, then why don't we look and act more like insurers? Two more comments, actually three more, and then I'll sort of open up for questions, I think. The insurer is going to invest in more risky assets than a DB scheme because it's set up to do so. The 15% of profit that the insurer will extract, and this is the key point, is already inside the DB scheme. And prior to handover, it belonged to the trust, then to the sponsor. And on the day of risk transfer, the day of the transaction, it was in effect a 15% gift from the sponsor and the trust, i.e. UK PLC, and that gift is made directly to the insurer's shareholders. Let's call them non-UK PLC. So I would sort of really sort of put open, so this suggests a forward path. If we ran the DB scheme like an insurer and we should be able to extract 15% for the good of members and the sponsor. Contrary to some advisors' belief, there is no magic practice by the insurance industry. DB schemes can do it for themselves. We do need to understand what the directional changes required to do this are, and many people on the call, no doubt, will have their own thoughts on it. But the bottom line is it can't be beyond the wit of the DB industry to do the same as insurers, to extract the 15% to benefit UK PLC and the members, and basically run on for the life of the scheme. It appears that up until about a year ago, there was only one solution for any CFO, which was to get the scheme bought out. Now, of course, there's significantly more opportunities and options, including third-party capital. And this one that I'm currently have been talking about for some time now to anybody who's got the patience to listen, requires no change in regulations, requires no change in structure, just requires a fundamentally different attitude to how to manage risk within a DB scheme. And most importantly, the one word which will come up during the conversation is understanding the power of matching adjustment in Solvency II. Because that is, if you apply that into the DB world, then you really are opening up a massive opportunity for current schemes to run on. And so on that note, I'll leave it there. If there are any obvious questions, please raise them.
Well, thank you, Paul. I mean, that is the shortest address that we've had for some time. And you've given us the most opportunity to ask questions. So as the chair, I'll ask the first one. Can you speak a little bit more to the solution that you're proposing so that we can get our teeth into it?
Yes, so at the moment, the solution is, and I sort of would act like an insurer. And so when you're sitting at the trustee board, first of all, you've got to have a fully equipped trustee board to understand, you know, I mentioned very specifically, when you look inside how an insurer is set up in terms of executives and risk experience and actuaries and all those resources are inside the machine. You're not reliant on third parties to be able to understand most of the issues that are needed to run it. So I would say, you know, one of the things, if you want to act like an insurer, we're going to have to upskill the risk management set, perhaps, of many schemes in order to really fully understand what's going on. Secondly, it requires a system, and I always call it the F9 approach, hitting F9 on a keyboard, for everyone who is a stakeholder, which includes the sponsors, includes advisors, includes everybody, but they look at a single system whereby they know exactly where the liquidity is. They know exactly what the risks being taken are. They know exactly what the last performance reporting is, and it's available, quote unquote, on a daily basis. At the moment, I sort of see the standard DB risk management system is generally highly fragmented, spread across multiple counterparties, and most of the systems do not talk to each other. And hence you end up with things like the LDI crisis. So we need to look at risk management systems. We need to look at how a trustee board is set up. And then we also need to understand this magic quotient of matching adjustment. And people who extol the virtues of insurance must love matching adjustment, which I think holds a lot of essence into it. But what it basically allows, and it's actually for 90% of DB schemes, it's a very old concept. It's taking the yield of your assets into your discount rate directly, one for one. So you lose volatility on market risk and gain increase in risk on pure default. But the bottom line is, I suppose, to put it crudely, when an insurer takes over a standard portfolio, it increases the risk by 1% of that portfolio. They increase the discount yield immediately on the liabilities by around about the same number, matching adjustment of 1%. And bingo, the liabilities fall by 12%. And how much capital do you need to set up a standard risk transfer exercise? Around about 12%, maybe 13%. So in actual fact, all the capital that the insurer generates from the transaction is inside the box already. And all they're doing is applying some relatively normal concepts, quote unquote, which already exists in DB world, which is take the yield of your assets and put it mathematically and rules-based into your discount rate. And by that method, you suddenly realize that when you hand over 100 of assets against 100 of liabilities, all that happens on the other side of the balance sheet when you look at an insurer is the liability side goes to 90 because they're now discounting at a high yield based on a new set of assets. And that means there's still 100 of assets, and therefore the capital must be 10, just doing round numbers. Mm-hmm. So my whole point about this is we've got a lot of the financing is already embedded in the schemes. But if we apply some insurance principles to run on, and I think the insurance companies run a really good shop. I mean, if I wanted to set up an ALM risk management business, I'd set up an insurer, so to speak. So why don't we adapt a lot of those issues across into the DB world? And I've done a small straw poll of actuaries and asked them how many of them use matching adjustment practice when dealing with their DB scheme liabilities, and the answer is none. And then you ask the question, is it possible to do that? And you normally get a, no, I'm not too sure. I've done it on one small case, or maybe. But the bottom line is, it's not beyond the wit of all of us to apply this particular practice, which could be for enormous benefit for our members and enormous benefit for the sponsor.
Thank you. I have got another question, but I'd rather hear from Porrig first. Porrig, you have your hand up. You want to come off mute?
Yeah, so Paul, thanks for the lovely short presentation of your position. I wish more people did that. Not necessarily here, just in general. You asked yourself there, why don't we do it? Okay. And I've been speaking to people about this concept of runoff a long time. There are some people who've been really working and spending a lot of money on building propositions for a number of years. But why aren't we doing it? Can you just give us an exposition of why we're not doing it? Because it seems to be such a bloody good idea. And how much, sorry, slight supplementary, and how much of it is the fact that the potential trailblazers don't want to be the first one to do it in case something goes wrong and they then get caught in the spotlight?
No, I don't because we don't have to change anything, we don't have to change any regulation, we don't have to change any governance, we don't really have to change anything to do this. This is more a change of practice. And I would say the inertia is because there are very much established practices which exist. And the established practice has also spent the last 20 years saying, well, you know what your end route is, it's to go to an insurer. And you ask most CFOs, they don't have time to sort of consider, and they've been told for the last 10, 15 years, they should be taking to insurance. Many advisors genuinely believe that insurers are magical, if I can use that word, and it represents a completely different plane. So I think the problem is inertia, and there's a lot of people out there who don't necessarily want to change their working practices. There's a very viable industry advising pension schemes. Why change it?
Well, quite, but just like CDC is an opportunity for the industry to create a proper annuity business, if you like, because it is going to go on where otherwise DC will remove the opportunity for the consulting and investment advice for many of the people that are out there. This seems to be obvious that it retains the kind of balance that we have within the industry now. People have been able to offer advice. So why aren't they pushing harder? Because let's face it, often the consultants and the actuaries can be the gatekeepers and stop things happening. Is it the industry itself that's a bit conservative? Because it would seem to give them an opportunity to build a much more sustainable business.
Okay, so at the risk of being controversial, so one of the things that I see as imbalanced is the reliance on advisors. I believe you enter into a completely different relationship with far higher value extracted from the advisor when you can take on the advisor in terms of a peer-to-peer relationship. And for those of you who've been through various medical treatments, you all know that the worst thing to do is to walk into a consultant and not have a clue what's going on, because if you can't ask the right questions, you don't get the options to come out. But my experience has been, if you can raise the level of dialogue from the trustee board to be it the actuary, be it the investment consultant, be it all and the lawyers, you really need to up your game in order to get better advice, in order to move the conversation forward. I'm sure there are many people here who've gone into investment committee meetings, watched an investment consultant give their presentation and asked the trustee board if they got any comments, and they're generally not. Now, we all know there are thousands of exceptions to that, but the really bottom line is, so one of my ex-colleagues turned around to me and said, gosh, what you're saying is if you wouldn't get a job with an insurer, you shouldn't be a DB trustee. And I thought that was a very interesting observation. And also, I think carries some weight. Why are insurers so good at what they do? Because they've got all the kit and the experience to run this really vicious ALM exercise, which DB, you suddenly jump back into the DB world where you don't need any expertise in anything to do it. And you sort of like, how do you square that circle? So the issue is, I think, until trustees up their game, I think the status quo may continue.
Porrig, are you comfortable? We move on?
Yeah, by all means.
Okay, well, I think there are some interesting headwinds which trustees are facing. One headwind is the historic approach, I think it's changing, of the pension regulator to operating discount rates which are based on likely performance of the assets. And the other is the innate conservatism of the legal profession, who dominate the regulator, among other things, that have held back pension schemes from investing rather than de-risking. Would you like to comment on those two assertions? Do you think I'm right?
I think there's a lot in what you say, and in particular in the latter point regarding the legal profession. My last 2 or 3 rounds on the risk transfer transaction merry-go-round, it's been actually quite interesting, whereas the risk transfer consultants will openly discuss matching adjustments and the risks, and some will sort of say, actually, you know, insurance isn't a gold standard, it's silver standard. And of course, there's something silver standard that opens up a lot of questions to ask about it. That's not to say any of them are killers, it's just you need to understand what you're doing, so to speak. The legal profession, I hope there's no, I don't want to sound unfair, but I've noticed that the legal profession are particularly conservative. One turned around to me in the middle of a risk transfer and said, well, look, your sponsor is willing to pay for it. How are you going to feel if you don't do it and your sponsor goes into liquidation? And that was the end of the comment. And I thought that's really interesting, because the last thing you were going to say to me, how are you going to feel if you do it and the insurer goes into liquidation? It was almost like an asymmetric belief system. And I'm pretty comfortable suggesting that the tail risks of running a DB scheme, which many sponsors believe they're transferring by doing a risk transfer, might not be as clean, shall we say, as the break they think it is. But I'm pretty comfortable saying that the generic legal advice given to a CFO, which goes something along the lines, you've got to get rid of this thing in case it one day kills you. And that's almost like the end of the conversation. And a CFO simply doesn't have the time to really understand how to run an off-balance sheet life insurance company called a DB scheme. Now, there are lots of permutations on that, depending on the revenue stream from the sponsor, the quality, the credit strength of the sponsor, the size of the scheme, lots of relative arguments in there. But the bottom line is, I believe there's still a lot of advice going on to sponsors saying, you've got to get rid of this thing. It will kill you. Don't know when, but it will kill you. And very, very conservatively. There's no real advice going around where saying, let me show you how to run this thing on at minimal risk. And by the way, we will show you what those risks are. And a part of that is also that the sponsor, the trustee, need to be absolutely in lockstep with what's going to happen in the future, not dealing with it by getting a 4 a.m. call because you've run out of liquidity. Having an automatic, just like they do in Solvency II, and this comes back to my original open gambit, which is, if an insurer does it, why don't we do it? And one of the things, so I had a period of time where I got approved to be a Solvency II life insurance director. And the one thing it taught me, it says, when you're considering risk, stop worrying about what are the chances of that risk happened. That is not the question the regulator wants to know. The regulator wants to know, what are you going to do if that risk happens? Which is a very, very different headset. But that's the sort of framework you need to have agreed with the sponsor today, when there isn't a crisis going on.
Yeah.
These are what we're going to do. These are the risks we face. We can all see them because we all can sit and press F9 on our desks, see exactly what's going on. And if the following events happen, this is what we're going to do.
Okay, so you could say you could have that conversation with your sponsor. The difficulty the sponsors have, as you said, is that they haven't got the time or the capacity to engage with very difficult questions like running an insurance company called a DB scheme. And likewise, most trustees aren't in a position to stand up and be counted on this one. So this would point, if you aren't going to move towards the risk transfer to an insurance company, towards co-sponsorship through, say, a capital back plan, or even a movement to a super fund, both of which have been touted as sensible by the regulator recently. What's your view on co-sponsorship? What's your view on super funds?
Okay, so when I look at Solvency II, it is the most, which is being watered down, but let's put that to one side. Solvency II is the most phenomenal structure. It's a principles-based system, and it's basically saying this is the rule book, and we want to make sure that this insurance entity, be it life or property and casualty, will not fall over. And I've worked with some of the most intelligent, crafty, sophisticated, structured products guys. I said, find me a way around Solvency II. Where are the loopholes? Where can we stuff 3 billion% yielding assets in it? And the bottom line is, because it's principles based, it's pretty much watertight. In fact, people are saying it's overly watertight. Okay. So there's a really good framework sitting behind the insurance industry. And the second thing is, you've got a regulator who's making sure that the insurers, the participants playing in the sandpit of Solvency II, stick by the rules. And it's a very intrusive regulator. It's a financial risk regulator. It's not a governance regulator. And so you've got these sort of two things which are making sure the insurers do their job. And the insurers have to do their job controlled by these two frameworks because they are injecting third-party capital. Soon as you inject third-party capital, obviously there are massive conflicts of interest, which Solvency II and the regulator seeks to advise. So to now answer your question, Henry, the problem I have with any third-party capital, it's not the way, it's not the structure, it's not the yield. We can all work out. I mean, I've seen some ridiculous ones and I've seen some very tidy ones. But the bottom line is, there is no abiding framework to which to work to, nor is there a regulator who's going to really oversee in the interest of policyholders / members. So in general, on capital, as soon as you inject third-party capital, I tend to demur to it's overly complicated. And by the way, I've got enough capital in an existing DB scheme. Why do I need third-party capital?
I can see that argument if you come at it from the perspective that you do. I think there are other perspectives, and we've got quite a few people on this call who might like to challenge. I'm rather hoping that one or two will. Otherwise, we're going to have a very short session. Porrig, you put your hand up again. Thank you, sir.
I think Peter's put his hand up, Henry.
Right, sorry, Peter. Do excuse me, I was just killing an incoming call. Peter, put your case.
Right. Okay. Am I live? Yes. Right. Yes. Just to pick up on this first thing, you talked about the insurance company pricing their transactions, but in the terms of risk transfer, is it not, in fact, the actuaries to the pension schemes who have determined how the insurance company should price risk transfer, bulk annuity transactions? Because the Pensions Act 75 says the 75 debt should be based on the actuary's estimate of the insurance company's, the cost of an insurance company buyout of the pension scheme. And the actuaries have determined that that should be based on the gilt yield. And therefore, when we come to the situation where the gilt yield goes negative, the cost of the buyout becomes very much higher and doesn't bear any resemblance to the insurance company's asset profile that it's using to finance that deal. As it's fallen down now, and the gilt yield is much closer to the insurance company's asset model, are we not in the danger of having the insurance risk increased substantially because they are now competing for the same business? They know what their competitors are going to be charging because that's laid down. That's been determined by the pension schemes themselves, what they will pay for it. And is that not totally distorting the market and has led to excessive profits for the insurance company at the expense of pension schemes in the past, and particularly those that have matched them with LDI? I have a feeling that the whole marketplace is wrong, and the TPR, by using a gilt-based model for technical provisions, is missing the fundamental point. Sorry, my rant.
I think there's a lot in there, but I suppose the bottom line is that if you went to the TPR and said, I'm going to use matching adjustment principles to work out what my surplus is, I think the TPR would struggle to say that's not valid. They might ask you how you're going to handle risk and what systems you have in place for it. Yeah, good questions. But the bottom line is, to me, that all the insurers are doing is taking your very de-risked portfolio and re-risking it. And there's the irony. The insurers, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, I'm just saying they've got the systems to manage the risk. There's nothing stopping us from doing it at home. We just don't have the systems in place, either HR or technology, to do the same trade for ourselves. But there's absolutely no reason why. And those excessive profits, I don't, 14% yield on capital, I think it's okay given the risks that they're running. But the point is, that's all UK PLC's money, being brutal. There's 50 to 75 billion. People have been talking about, oh, we really need to support UK PLC. Well, there's 50 to 75 billion locked up in overfunded DB schemes, because the way we run DB schemes is overly conservative. We don't use the same techniques that the insurers do, who are the all hallowed gold standard, etc., yada, yada, yada. So we've got the solution in front of us. We could release 50 to 75 billion, and we don't. And this is why the question is very important. How do we change that? Because I'm just one. There's loads of me advocating the actual fact there's a lot of stuff to be done at home, but at the moment it seems none of us wants to do it, or we can't get ourselves organized to do it.
I think there are plenty of people on this call who are trying to organize themselves to do it, Paul, and one of them's got his hand up, and that's William McGrath. Before I move to him, Peter, are you comfortable with the answer to your question?
Yes, I think so. We suggested to the regulator that we should, with a strong employer's covenant, we should be using an asset-based valuation model for our regulations. And they said, well, yes, you can do that, but we will just apply a gilt-based valuation model to your scheme and assess your risk against that. So there's little point in you doing that. So we got stuck in that situation. So we adopted gilt-based valuation model. We now say, right, we do that for the regulator. We are moving. We're satisfying the regulator that we're fully funded. So we don't require deficit recovery contributions. Therefore, we're ignoring it from here on, and we're doing our own valuation of the risk of the scheme, the returns of the scheme, with the scheme objective to pay the scheme to pay the pensions as they fall due, and not pass it out.
What's your current funding position against TPs, Peter?
waiting for the up-to-date information, but it looks like 180% funded.
Oh dear.
Yeah, 180% funded is a real problem.
Yeah, it is. It is because what we've got now, and effectively, we have sucked deficit recovery contributions out of the employer that were never required.
Yeah.
To provide the benefits that we're providing. So our employer has been able to afford it without any issues, but that's not the same for many other companies. And so I don't want to use ourselves as an example because we're in a particularly unique situation. And in fact, we are improving benefits. We gave a 10% discretionary increase this year. And that sort of thing. But yes, but we had this debate. I should emphasise that our case was taken up by a certain actuary called Dirk Benstead, and he had a few battles with the regulator, but and he didn't seem to win them. But there we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. William, and then we'll come to Shane.
Yeah, as Paul knows, I'm a great fan of a lot of what he's saying, and I'm sure if a number of people start hammering away on a few of these points, you'll start to make progress. I think what is missing at the moment to try and move things forward is some basic numbers. I make the quip that T.S. Eliot line, everybody talks about poetry, nobody shows us a poem. And actually what is needed is a poem which really looks at the financial position of a lot of schemes now, and that's why we're so keen on TAS 300, is just look at the downside risk and the upside potential. And once you've got a proper paper that the actuaries have consistently hidden from producing, both the downside risk because the PPF is ignored, and the upside because they don't think there is one. And so when you've done that exercise, I think you can go back around all these target audiences that I think Paul was getting at as well, is you can talk to sponsors, the finance director, but even more importantly, I think now, the chair and the chief exec, because there is an upside. And there is the extra feature, which is now coming to the fore over the last 18 months, but even more so now, is public policy change. The chair and the chief exec do respond to public policy changes in terms of what the government would like you to do. So I think that is not to be sneezed at. And I think when you actually have hard numbers to look at, what is in the interests, I know it's not really about the best interest of members, as the lawyers keep telling us, it's about what's the purpose of the scheme. But when you actually look at numbers which suggest that there is an upside for members and very little downside, they have to start factoring it in. So I think you get back to this point that we've done with our C-suite PS analytics. That is what's missing. You've got to have real numbers which demonstrate what a difference it would make if you run it on a different basis. You don't need to think, I don't think, that you can get good folk in to run the scheme over the long term if you don't want to run it too much yourself. I think that's dead easy, plenty of good folk to do. So I think we are on the cusp of a significant change in attitude, which is what's needed, because there's now a new consensus, not just like people on this call. I think we've had a big influence on policy generally, and I think now we just got to keep attacking, and that's why I'm bang on about TAS 300. It just gives you a marketing tool to say to everybody, you've got to look at this again. So I'm quietly optimistic that all these barriers which are there and have quietly seen everybody off over the last few years in actually doing anything will start to disappear.
Thank you. Could I just say before Paul comes back, all these videos get sent around, yeah, not just on my blog, but they get circulated elsewhere, and they find their way into public policy committees and they get commented on, and we get a lot of feedback on. And you know, it is really, really helpful to have comments like those we've just had, adding to the weight of comments from historic videos which we've sent round. And once we've got sufficient of this evidence, I think that we can send it off to this new pensions review and say, cop a load of this, because there's a lot of good sense being talked. Sorry, Paul, it's your comment, not mine, but that was just an interjection from me.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to Peter's comment earlier,
Yeah.
and Williams, you know, I just thought I just played a little mind game where I extracted the risk management board of Rothsay, and I put them in charge of a pension fund, and I sent them off to the TPR. What do you think, you know, in terms of, oh, well, how, you know, whether you're going to do a gilt space? Do you really think, you know, it would be rather ridiculous if the TPR suggested that the risk management board at Rothsay, who are completely Solvency II based, didn't apply Solvency II principles, and yet that would be entirely, according to Peter's comment, inconsistent with where the regulator's coming from. So this is one of the issues I suppose I have if I'm asking for change in the regulatory side. The one thing I think the PRA does a reasonable job of is being a risk regulator, financial risk regulator. The TPR is not, in my view, it's a governance regulator. You know, provided your governance is okay, they'll just go to whatever the rule book says on risk. So when you go in and you show something different, there's nobody to actually talk to about it, because unless it's been enshrined in some long piece of case law history 20 years ago, it's not really applicable to everybody. But I was just enjoying myself thinking about the risk management board at Rothsay, walking into the TPR and telling them how to run a pension fund. And guess what? It would be different to the way it's currently run.
That's a lovely point. Shay, would you like to say something?
Yes, thank you, Henry. Thank you, Paul, for a very interesting presentation, and I fully support all your facts. Just have a quick question. So when you indicated that a DB scheme can be run as an off-balance sheet insurance company or something similar, are you suggesting that a DB scheme could be formally reconstituted from a trust to a company?
No, apologies for that. That was my shorthand. A DB scheme is already an off-balance sheet entity for the sponsor. The balance sheet is not consolidated, it's just the net effect. But when I started pointing this out, that basically, you know, people who make widgets are running offshore off-balance sheet asset liability life insurance companies, I was looked upon as if I was slightly nuts. They said, no, that's the pension scheme. No, a pension scheme is an off-balance sheet life insurance company run by a set of trustees. And I'm not suggesting, and this is why I mentioned earlier, that what I'm looking to do requires no change in the regulation, means no change in technically in the governance structure, because we could refashion how we run a DB scheme for run-on, make it look like an insurer, ironically, but in actual fact, you don't need to change any of the way that it's governed and set up and legally. So my apologies for that confusion. But the bottom line is, if you look at any DB scheme, it is an off-balance sheet life insurance company.
Okay, thank you. So the legal basis would continue to be a trust, but
absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Shay. I can see you still got your hand up, William, and you've been.
I think made my points.
Right, Con. Delighted to see you awake, Con. We had the pleasure last week of your narcolepsy. So good to see you back on top form, man.
Well, a week ago, I'd actually had no sleep the night before, which was really quite funny. Anyway, the point is, the regulator really does insist on this excessive funding approach. The classic, I think, is yet to be seen in the application of the new DB code. There we're talking about a discount rate which is based on low dependency, which they're talking about being gilt plus 50 or whatever. That's that really doesn't show any signs of a new attitude from the pensions regulator. The pensions regulator has consistently pushed people to adopt lower and lower discount rates throughout pretty much their entire history. It even encouraged investment to match the discount rate in promoting LDI, as they undoubtedly did. So I think one of the problems you are going to have is getting the regulator to accept the idea that you want to run a DB scheme as if it were an insurance company. The accounting is very, very different. And actually, just to make one very small point, technically both FRS 102 and IAS 19 bring the deficit or surplus onto the sponsor's balance sheet. So you know, sort of the offshore or external nature really isn't what it really isn't the case, and it's that inclusion which drove many finance directors to adopt strategies like LDI, and that was the basis on which deficit repair contributions were being made and so on. And those costs were most definitely being recognized by the sponsor employers. But I think unless we get a completely different approach from the pensions regulator, running on is going to be a minority sport, much as I would like it to be a majority sport or the majority sport. Those are my comments, Paul.
Thank you, Con. And I sort of agree with you, but I just wrote down here as you were talking. I've got an asset, and let's say I've got the same liability portfolio, but I've got an asset portfolio of gilts +3, 0% capital, and that's okay because that's low dependency. Now I've got an asset pool of gilts +150. I've got 15% of capital. That's called Solvency II. So according to your rule book, the regulator would bring the risk management group of Rothsay to heel and tell them off because they're taking far too many risks and there's just not the capital sufficient, and yet they are completely Solvency II compliant. So I sort of agree with you. I also think the other side to this is the actuarial profession, where you need to, linking the assets and the liabilities. If it's good for the insurers, there should be no reason why we don't do it in DB world.
Paul,
so how do we get that changed?
I think we actually are in agreement here. I think if I took Rothsay's balance sheet to TPR as if it were a pension fund today, they would actually find themselves getting demands for further deficit repair contributions. I don't think there's much doubt about that. It's, you can argue which is sort of the wrong case. But given that we now want more investment, more productive investment into our economy, now I think is the time to start lobbying government over this. Back 2 years, Ian Clacker, Philip Bennett and I wrote a letter to the Department of BEIS and to the Pensions Minister, which we are in the process of redrafting and going back again, which suggests that the discount rates applicable should be more in line with asset returns than anything else. That we should actually have done in the course of the next couple of weeks. But that's going to go to pensions, working pensions, Rachel Reeves, and the whole lot, because we think that without it, you're not going to get any money coming out of DB into the productive uses they want.
Can I 100% agree that that's what perhaps that's where it all changes, because as you say, there is no real mandate to move towards a more risk-taking trustee board when you've got a very risk-averse by nature regulator.
Yeah, no, agree.
That's okay. What needs to change. And by the way, I also want to sort of challenge lots of people to say, oh, well, you want pension funds to invest in productive assets. And my argument is, no, you don't. What you want is you want to give 50 to 75 billion back to UK PLC through
the UK PLC to invest.
For
UK PLC to invest.
No, yeah, for them, that's to me, that's a direct investment.
There's an incredibly strong argument, Paul, which I will just go into. The tangible investment is now around 157 billion pounds. Intangibles are around 186 billion. Now, those are capitalized values, but are you going to invest as a pension fund in intangible assets? That's going to make life rather difficult for you. The other thing which ought to be recognized is that companies are currently investing an awful lot of money. In fact, about 60% of their investment goes into 60% of the money which goes into intangibles is not capitalized. It's just treated as a straightforward expense. Large among those is staff training or employee training. So, are we sure we want pension schemes to be investing in this, or do we just want to reduce the costs of providing pension schemes to employers so that employers can invest? Because they're the people who understand the value of brands and intangibles, and that seems to be the area which is driving most growth in productivity in developed economies. But that's a side rant from where we were on the other. But those are supporting arguments for lowering discount rates to sensible levels, and indeed adopting an insurance type approach to the valuation of valuation of liabilities and the valuation of the assets supporting them.
Thank you, Con. Should I kind of move on to Peter and then to John Quinlivan, because it would be good to hear from both of you. Peter.
Yes, just picking up on that, and I support everything that's being said so far, but I think we're overcomplicating DB pension schemes. They are basically a series of payments made into the future, cash payments, and they are to do that you're trying to get matching cash inflows, whether they're from interest or dividends or from redemption proceeds of term investments. The outgoings are pretty well known, particularly in closed schemes. The only uncertainty is inflation, how much they're going to inflate each year. Surely the appropriate measure for the scheme is actually what is the investment yield in real terms that scheme requires to meet those cash outflows. And that, to me, seems to be related to the rate of inflation, not the gilt yield. And the gilt yield, by its volatility, is causing all sorts of unfortunate consequences. If we got back to the basics of cash flow, then I think we will actually simplify the matter greatly, and that risk can be managed within the pension scheme without having to have all the costs of the operational controls of an insurance company. That's my view.
And it's exactly what the insurers already do, because they're just cash flow obsessed, and that's called the matching adjustment book, which is 99% of the books. So, I often get sort of, oh, insurance is very complicated. No, it's not. It's as simple as you say. It's a cash flow match book, and that's why I would advocate exactly the same as you're suggesting, Peter.
I'll move on to John. John, I think you probably got a very technical question. You come off me.
Yeah, no, not particularly technical. I mean, I agree with the vast majority actually of what Paul said here, which is I think the MA build is very complex. A true MA build is very complex. It's heavy duty engineering, very scientific. Naturally, it's a non-trivial thing to do. So it isn't to do it properly is tough, genuinely. I think I've got a question, but another comment. I think the other thing is a very large pension fund becomes a very small insurer. So that's my only comment in that space, which is, and I'm not discounting what you said, Paul. There's a scale game here, clearly. And I guess that and I totally agree with Com's comment on productive capital. I think the fallacy with the productive capital piece has been it's different people have meant different things by it. Some have meant a VC startup equity, and I don't think that's the space for DB schemes. I think productive capital can be debt based, as we've alluded to here. But Paul, I guess the ultimate question is, what about the best of both worlds, where a pension fund potentially does a settlement event and the excess capital finds its way back to the members or the sponsor? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah.
A true insurance event.
Yeah, sort of like captive insurance.
Yes. Well, I mean, similar to a captive, but not a captive per se.
Yeah, no, I know where you're coming from. And, I come back to my original thought that my view is that all the necessary kit and framework is already in the DB sector. I don't think in the vast majority of cases, given that a well-funded scheme is sitting on 15% of capital under a Solvency II basis, or whatever number you want to put in there, and handing that capital off to a third party, whether in part or in a capital back journey plan or whatever, is necessarily a good use of sponsor and member resources. My view is that a number of pension funds are very, very well capitalized already and do not need a third party assistance. By definition, introducing a third party increases costs and increases governance risk. And one of the problems with non-PRA regulated entities is that the regulator really isn't looking out for the third party policyholder.
Sure. I'm thinking more about if there's a full Solvency II, full FSCS, with the capital flowing back to the sponsor stroke members rather than staying in the insurer, the excess capital, that model.
I know it very well, as you know. And my view on that is, valid, assuming that you fully understand what you're paying for and what you're getting. But the issue revolves that we don't actually need to do that. It's a complex way of doing a simpler trade, which is just to do it where we are and return the money to the sponsor through surplus return. But yes, your way is perfectly valid, just like handing it off to an insurer is, except at least in your case, the one you're alluding to, some of the money flows back to the sponsor.
Okay,
but
thank you.
My view is you don't need to set up such a complex structure.
We have got one or two other questions which remain unanswered in the chat, and I apologise for neglecting the chat today. Neil, John, and so on. My guess is that we're unusually together in our aim, although I think we may have slight differences about how we go about it. I think we've all got a fair degree of unanimity that we would like to see schemes work harder for longer and not capitulate to third parties where necessary. Using third parties from time to time is not a bad thing, but running on self-sufficiently is a good thing. Yeah, I would like to hear from anybody who actually doesn't view that as being a good long-term aim of any pension scheme. Okay, so the degree of unanimity, and I'd like to thank Paul very much for talking us through his insurance-based pension fund model, which makes a lot of sense. So, and brings a new perspective to the conversations we've been having. So can we give him a round of applause? And we look forward to progressive things ASAP. I don't know if you've got anyone lined up for next week, Steve.
We're in a conversation with a few, but not yet. But we could keep this going.
No, it would be. We have such a varied group of people, but one person who's very keen to talk to us is a fellow called Harry Scoffin, who has been running the leaseholder reform team, which has had a great amount of success in policy terms, and he's got a lot to say about the part that pensions have or haven't got to play in terms of a direction of travel for freehold and leasehold reform. So we may be getting him along. He's just mailed me this morning saying he'd like to do it. So without further ado, unless you've got, can you talk now? Are you in a quiet place, Steve?
No, it's still very noisy, but I just want to thank Paul for a fantastic session, and hope Paul enjoyed it, and hope everybody else enjoyed it, and wish everybody a great day and a great week. And as usual, we say for peace in the East, peace in the Middle East. So that's what we always say. But excellent session, Paul. We'll put the video up later today, and really appreciate your time and your input. Thanks for everybody's questions.
Can we make it later today, Steve? Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, okay. All right. Cheers, everyone. Take care. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks, Paul.
Bye. Cheers, Paul. Bye. Bye.